Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome. I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Wharfe McIntyre, the director of the new film The Flood. And so welcome. It's very lovely to be chatting to you from the other side of the planet. And so yeah, if you could just introduce yourself, and I'd like to get a bit of interest and a bit of insight into your background in film. Obviously, this is your debut feature film, and I've seen in a couple of other interviews that you have a bit of an acting background as well. So, what's your kind of background in film and your progress into this film?
Well, hello, Jordan, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you to anybody who's taking the time to listen. I do appreciate it very much. Describing an acting background is probably a bit of a leap. Although, mind you, I did study drama and I did have a few professional gigs, but let's just say I was more on the hammy scale rather than the amazing performance like Alexis Lane gives in The Flood. So it became apparent that I was much better at telling the stories behind the camera than in front of the camera. And I think when you're a kid and you're watching movies and you fall in love with cinema, what you actually see are the actors. You don't really think about or even understand everything that goes into making a film. You just see the actors, so you think, oh, that's how I can make films. I'll get into acting. But of course, there's so many other fabulous facets to filmmaking. So really it was screenwriting is where I sort of moved into, and then the natural progression of that for any sort of like controlling personality type is to move into directing then, and getting to do it the way you think it should be done. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how I got.
So I noticed as well, you had a short film in 2017, Mirror, I think it was called, which has a similar narrative to The Flood. So was that kind of a test run for this film, and you had the feature in mind, or did the feature was that born out of the short film?
Yeah, the feature was born, well, certainly inspired by the short film. That short film very much is centered on a First Nations soldier in World War II returning home, and the things that happened to him in that film happened to almost all the Indigenous soldiers who served our country, shockingly. And the Alexis Lane, who stars in The Flood, she had a very small role in Miro. She played Miro's wife, and she was so incredible, so powerful, just in a couple of scenes, that I just wanted to write a feature as a kind of a vehicle for her. But also that film just really expanded my desire to speak really broadly about our nation and just race relations and where we're at, and the injustice that is still to this day exists. So yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
And yeah, I've just mentioned Alexis Lane, who plays Jara in The Flood, was in that short film. I just wanted to get your sort of maybe behind the scenes in-depth thoughts on her, and also Shaka Cook, who plays Waru in The Flood. Sort of like, what was it like working with them? They give some really strong performances in this film. Like, what was it like directing them?
Oh, it's an absolute delight. I absolutely loved every second of it. And they just deliver unbelievably. Like we didn't do take after take after take in the film. A lot of what you see is the first take or the second take. Sometimes we do three, and if there were technical issues to be sorted out, then there'd be more takes than that. But it was really only technical problems that caused us to do more, because they were just there and in it and delivering. And then to have a bit of playroom up my sleeve, I would say to Shaka particularly, not so much Alexis, because her character is different, and the rawness that she was bringing to it, I don't want to interfere with that at all. But with Shaka, I would just say to him sometimes, just give me something just really, really different, something, just a different take on this moment. And he would just come out with something unexpected. And quite often that made it into the film, you know. So they're just so talented and just fantastic to work with.
So would you say
as is Dean Kerr?
Yeah. So would you say that
Seamus.
So would you say that as a director, then, like, would you say you're more hands-on or hands-off in terms of, like, as a director, like, what's your approach really in terms of, you know, directing not just the main cast but the supporting cast as well? Like, what's your approach with direction?
I want everyone to deliver their best, and everybody needs a different approach to be able to do that. So for me, there's no blanket approach to any of it. It's really individually based, and whatever support they need to get there or to express that, I'll do that. I'd like to think I don't have any ego around the process. It's whatever is required to get there is fine with me. And I'm very collaborative. I want to hear the best ideas from everybody and go with, you know, the best idea wins. And quite often my idea is not the best idea.
So in terms of this, in terms of this film as well, you're obviously the writer of the film as well. So in terms of collaboration and reaching out to, you know, inspiration and getting inspiration from people on set and such, how much of the film was any improvisation? Like, what was the writing process like as well? Because this film has a lot of, you know, different narrative strands that kind of interweave and different subplots that some of them kind of go off completely, some of which kind of come back into the main narrative and overlap. Like, what was it like writing that? And as I say, was there any sort of improvisation and such?
There was definitely like scripted changes during the shoot, which most often were determined because most of the film's shot outdoors. And we had this torrential flooding rains, and like there were landslides, there was like these remote locations, so there were a lot of pressures on the time that we had, and sometimes it would just be a case of, well, you can't shoot that much, you need to condense the meat of it. So I would just do a rewrite on set. I'd send everybody for a cup of tea for 10 minutes and I'd just look at the scene and restructure it, and we'd go from there. And there wasn't a lot of improvisation in terms of dialogue or anything like that, because it's not a very dialogue driven film. There's not a lot of dialogue in it. But the way, because we were shooting OneShots wherever possible, Kevin Scott, the DOP, and I've kind of been obsessed with trying to do everything in a one shot if we can. So we would get on set and then the actors would have their run and we would watch them, how they're going to perform the scene. And then we would figure out how we can best film it around their performance. So it was really collaborative and alive in the moment. of shooting it. And I think that gives it a rawness or a real feel. Like, I think you can feel like there's always just a bit of an edge through it. Well, I think that there is. I mean, you might disagree with me, and everyone will have their own opinion, but I think that you can feel a sense of rawness and realness. And I think that's because of that approach.
And then in terms of, you mentioned about cutting things out, was there anything specifically in the film that maybe was in the original script or you had ideas for in terms of including things that maybe had to be cut down? Anything specific that you had to cut out?
Yes, there are a couple of heartbreaking scenes that I had to lose. But that they were more around just sort of more interesting moments that weren't really, I suppose, necessary to drive the narrative forward.
Okay.
And I think the most of it is in there, but there was some nighttime scenes that I really loved, and some earlier stuff from earlier in the film, in the mission, but in the end they just weren't working with how the film was emerging. For the films determine themselves in a way, that it feels right, and then when it doesn't feel right, you have to just let that go. So
yeah, just come back to one of the questions I asked, which you kind of touched on a little bit there, was the narratives. Obviously there's a lot of different subplots and a lot of different strands to the narrative. What was it like managing all of those in the writing process and the direction?
Well, when I write, it's a very it's sort of like, when people talk about getting into the flow, and it's almost like you channel it. It just comes through. And I was just letting it come through. And yes, there are a lot of characters and there are a lot of subplots, but to me, that's what life is. We live that on a daily basis, where we've got 10 different subplots going with friends and family and this and that. And so that just feels kind of natural and real to me, which is not typical of films. Like, typically we're told you've got to have your 3-act structure, you've got your central character, we travel that hero's journey, and that just wasn't right for this film. And I think that's also got a lot to do with the fact that it has such strong First Nation influence stories in there, and we made it together, and that is more of a First Nation approach to storytelling. And the film demanded that, so I just went with it.
You've mentioned the realism of the film in terms of it feels brutally authentic in parts. How was it like managing that? Obviously there's some quite brutal scenes in there in terms of sexual assault and straight up violence. How was it like managing that in a way which was authentic and really portrayed the treatment of these people, but also was sort of managing the sensitivity of it as well? How was that as a director?
Well, fortunately, I have a background in psychotherapy, so I'm very well versed in holding the space for that level of authenticity and emotionality to be present. And I'm extremely comfortable with it. It doesn't frighten me. It's actually where I enjoy probably the meat of life the most, if you like, is being real, is sitting in those feelings. So it wasn't hard from that perspective, or difficult to manage. And I guess if it didn't feel real, we just did it till it did. There was never going to be, okay, we're out of time, that's it. No, I wouldn't. I just would refuse. And that didn't even happen anyway, because we were in country on land where these things happened, with incredibly powerful Indigenous elders, a lot of whom are even have roles in the film. And it really was like we were just suddenly back in time, and we were all playing out our roles of history. And it was hard for the cast and crew. Like they really felt it. And those days, like the massacre scene and the prison scene, they really felt it. And we had support there. We were supporting each other, and we were an incredibly tight-knit and close film family, if you like. And everyone was there for each other on and off set. And we all knew that what we were doing was certainly something important. It felt really important to be telling this. And we all felt honored to be granted the opportunity to tell it. And that really carried us through.
Yeah. In terms of the realism of it, I've got like two or three kind of questions that kind of stem off from that point. So I'll ask these ones, and hopefully we don't run out of time. Firstly, obviously you've got these like beautiful locations, the production design, the costume design, you do feel like you're back in that period. But at the same time, it does almost feel timeless in places. It kind of feels like there's this universality of it. And obviously, as a British person, there's implications for the events of the film, and even parallels. You could parallel some of the events of the film to the events that occurred in the United States and their treatment of Indigenous people. So it does feel really of its time in terms of its production design and its costume design and the locations and such, but also feels kind of timeless and kind of universal at the same time. Was that kind of an intention, or is that just something that's
totally the intention? Yeah, I wanted it to feel contemporary. So because it is still relevant, it is relevant for us all. It's fundamentally human stories around truth, reconciliation, forgiveness, revenge, redemption, all of those things that we'll probably forever be dealing with in one way or another as a species. So yeah, I wanted you to feel it's also like those otherworldly elements.
I was just going to ask about those.
The spirit world.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that.
Yeah, like yeah. Well, that's really, I mean, honestly, I didn't know how that was going to be represented, like how that was going to work. I had it in the script, but it wasn't until we were doing the shootout scene, like the big set piece at the end. And when we turned up to shoot that, and we're shooting it all out of order, so it wasn't the end of the shoot when we were doing it, but we turned up to shoot and everything was totally fogged out. And everyone, like the first AD was panicking and this and that. And I just looked at it and I just thought, oh, this is the spirit world. It's here, this. And so let's shoot this here. Well, I want to shoot this, get these people in. And we just shot a whole bunch of different stuff. And that was the inspiration for being able to dissolve and transpose and travel between the worlds, those particular worlds. So yeah, that's how that happened.
It's quite interesting as well. You've got I was going to ask about that. Sorry, I was just going to say, there's obviously the juxtaposition. You've got this kind of really brutally authentic portrayal of events, whilst also kind of being a bit revisionist. I know you've mentioned Tarantino's influences on the film, but then you've also got this kind of element of like magical realism with the spirit world. There's a scene where someone opens a door and it kind of transports into another scene. there's these dreamlike segments and the almost angelic footage that we get of various characters, and then the Indigenous singing, which kind of is in the present time, but also feels kind of distinct and separate and almost dreamlike. You've got these different elements of the film, which what was that kind of like, what was the intention there?
Well, to me, that spirit realm is as real as the real world. It's just another form of experience or sensation. And, you know, the envelopes of existence are so close to each other. And that's something that I really like exploring and opening up thoughts and seeds around that for an audience. So yeah, I guess that is actually really an expression of how I see things, and it was natural for me that it should be there in that way. And also, you know, it's a real honoring of First Nation spirit, the spirit world, the world of ancestors and history existing in the space that we're in, you know. And I think a lot of science fiction does that. You know, it's sort of like multiple realities and universes existing simultaneously. And this film is that, but those moments bleed through and we get to peek through those envelopes and layers. So yeah, I guess you could blame science fiction for that too.
And then in terms of the visuals, obviously I know you've talked quite extensively in previous interviews about the wanners. I don't want to necessarily ask you about that again, because you probably talked about that, you know, quite extensively. But in terms of some things I sort of met, some things I noticed particularly, which were quite striking, were there's a couple of moments of sort of really challenging eye contact in the film with the camera. What was the thought process?
Are you referring to Sarah?
So there's a couple of moments in flashback sequences or Jara herself. Yeah, there's a couple of moments that I noticed throughout the film where it's almost like they're challenging the viewer.
Really, it was being on set in the moment. It felt right and the thing to do. So I did it and I trusted in that. And this whole film is an exercise in trust. You've got to have balls of steel to make a film like this, because once you go down a rabbit hole like that, the knock-on effects throughout the film are kind of out of your control throughout the shoot.
Yeah.
And it is brave. It's brave to go, all right, I'm getting a hit on this. This feels good to me. Let's do it. And you just don't know if you're going to have to can all of that because it doesn't work with everything else.
Yeah.
But I just trusted. I just trusted my intuitive feeling, and that's what I went for, rightly or wrongly.
What's it been like, obviously, with the pandemic and things like that? How has that affected releases? I'm not sure when it released in other countries, but in terms of, I guess, release and was production affected? Like, when did you shoot this and things like that?
No, production wasn't affected, but not long after we finished shooting, the Currowan megafire came and destroyed most of the places that you see in the film. So it kind of really is this archive of an ancient Australian rainforest world that climate change has seen burnt to the ground, like is happening all around this planet. So and also Kangaroo Valley's my hometown where I live, so it was pretty tough at times in the edit suite, seeing the places that no longer exist, especially like our land as well, that was the Papua New Guinea scenes, the jungle that was all here at our place, which was all destroyed. So that was tough. And then not long later, the pandemic came along. So it hasn't been a great time to release an independent film, and that's for sure. But yeah, I think this film's a slow burner. It's not a razzle dazzle, a million people see it at once and it's never heard of again. I think it's a slow burning film. And I think maybe, well, certainly Australia probably isn't even ready for it yet. We're not ready to really confront what it's talking about yet, but hopefully we will be soon. And making films like this sort of pushes us closer towards that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real shame about the locations, because some of those sort of forest areas and just the landscapes and such, so as I mentioned before, the cinematography was beautiful, but it almost feels easy at times, I guess, when you have such beautiful locations like that.
Well, it might feel easy from the outside, but boy, it ain't easy getting 100 people into these remote kind of areas to shoot things. And there's no phone coverage, there's no, like, if the production office needed to tell us something, it was like a runner was spending a 2-hour return trip to get to us. And so in some ways it was good, because I got to go get some overtime in without them being aware of it sometimes. So that was nice. Not much, of course. Didn't do much overtime, just a bit.
Yeah, in terms of ease, I didn't mean in terms of production. I meant in terms of the cinematography, in terms of these beautiful landscapes. Yeah. It feels easy, I guess, to capture that beauty, but the cinematography was absolutely breathtaking throughout the film. We touched on that earlier as well.
You do have to know which lenses to use, of course, though, to make it good. So, and we used vintage Leica lenses from the 70s.
Right.
So they were rehoused. So it gives it that really like shot on film quality and look about it.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I was going to mention, actually. You mentioned you mentioned being in the edit suite there. There's a couple of sort of techniques, I suppose you could say, throughout the film, where I was wondering whether they were baked into the script or whether they were kind of born out through the edit and in the edit. In terms of, there's a couple of moments of in the action sequences, you kind of use repetition, and in other sequences, you use sort of replays of earlier sequences throughout the film, whether it be obviously the flashbacks to childhood versions of the characters is obviously in the script, but there's a couple of moments where you repeat footage, or you really quickly, so in those gunfights, maybe the cutting and the really sort of snappy editing. Were they baked into the script, or did they come out in the edit?
They weren't baked into the script as such. I think they're baked into me. So at the time of shooting things like bursting through doors and stuff like that, when we did that, I had in my mind, I want to be doing those quick cuts and that kind of thing. So that was there in the process of shooting them, but a lot of it really came in the edit. And quite often it would be a technical mistake, and fortunately I'm just sitting there watching it and I see this technical mistake and it's like, I love this is what we need to do here, and build that in. And once you start that, you start thinking about how you're putting the film together and how that can become thematically, visually through the film. So they inform each other.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And another thing as well in that regard as well is there's a lot of overlapping footage in terms of maybe a character's walking through a forest and there's sort of the next scene is transposed, or there's previous scenes. There's a moment with one of the police officers where the previous scenes are kind of amalgamating in his sort of consciousness. What was that again? Was that a very conscious from the onset, or was that something you sort of brought in later on after you'd shot the film?
Well, that particularly was definitely in the edit. And that was really driven because when he comes out of the police station and he leans up against the wall, the wall looked like a cinema screen to me. And I just thought, well, there should be imagery on that reflects where he's at, or what he's experiencing, or what he's not wanting to see. And he should be forced to see it.
Right.
You know, I think I might have done a bit too much forcing of people to see things in this film, perhaps. But yeah, that definitely sprang from just seeing that blank wall and wanting to project something onto it. And a lot of the transitions or the overlays, that first started as a technical error, but I just grabbed onto it and realized that this is a way to show the bleed through of those worlds that I was talking about, you know, and that history lingers, it lives in us and around us still, you know, it's inescapable, which is why we need to address it.
Yeah. There's some really striking images, actually. Two ones that really stuck in my mind. There's one where there's a crucifix. I think it's in a church, I believe. I'm not too sure when it was, but I think it's a crucifix which you kind of transpose onto the next scene as the characters are moving through the forest, I think. And there's another moment as well where Jorah is in the spirit realm in the kind of white attire, and it lingers in sort of almost in the sky. It felt quite, as I mentioned before, it felt quite angelic, dreamlike. So those moments really stuck with me. There's visual images, at least. And again, as well with the edit, there's a moment as well in the film where it kind of cuts from it. There's this really jarring cut from, there's a sign which says no dogs, and I think it says no blacks or something like that. And then it cuts, and obviously just the first image we see is one of the women holding a dog, which obviously sets up the later scene. You say about maybe you try and show too much, but I think sometimes things like that are quite effective as really striking images, as I mentioned. Then sometimes things like that need to be shown quite strikingly.
Yeah, well, I agree. And so when Jarrah in the white dress, or in those sort of like moments that you're talking about, for me, that's always been her higher self, her spirit self, whatever you want to call that is actually carrying her through her darkness. So she doesn't even realize that she is there for herself yet. And it's when we see that colonial dance scene, and she sees herself looking at herself, that's when she starts to wake up.
I mean,
she knows that she needs to address it at that point, otherwise madness comes.
I mean, she mentions at one point in the film as well, I think is it Seamus, his name? One of the characters, is it? I can't remember who it was. I think it was him. But anyway, Jorah basically says, "No, they didn't break me; they made me." And it's this kind of, as you mentioned, and that kind of gets drawn out and then leads into that sort of self-realization of that realm almost.
Yeah, it really does. And I love that. I love seeing that, because I really feel that is what happens so often with people who've experienced trauma, that when they, you know, you can collapse, or you can lash out when you've experienced trauma, or you can just leave the building. And she definitely chooses to lash out, and then she has to process that and grow through that. And that's what those images are all about. So I'm very thrilled that you've picked up on that.
Also, there's a couple of moments in the film where I almost felt like it wasn't what was being shown on screen wasn't necessarily the reality of the situation. I mean, it might have just been, I don't know, maybe I misinterpreted, or maybe the way the scene was came across was maybe a bit more open-ended, I guess. But for instance, the one particular scene I'm thinking of is the scene in the bar where Jorah goes in and kills the men in the bar. It almost feels like it's like an idealized version of what she wants, because it's kind of no reaction from the men. They don't really look to draw arms or defend themselves. It almost feels like, I mean, you've talked about the Tarantino influences. It almost feels like she goes in there and that's in her head what she wants to do. And, maybe that's not necessarily the reality of the situation. Is that am I reading too much into that? Or
maybe it didn't go down quite how we saw it. I mean, ultimately the guys are dead, but I wanted us to see it in that kick-ass, stylized, joyful kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
I want us to enjoy that moment and relish that violence, because then we also have to confront the result of that, which is what happens after she's done it.
Yeah.
And she's standing there and she realizes that she has become evil herself. Which, again, I'm not quite sure if I mentioned that earlier, but yeah, I really think we don't get to see that often enough in film. So often violence is just perpetrated and it's either funny or stylish or brutal, but we just move on. Whereas that moment of her after she's done that and realizing that it hasn't eased her pain at all, it's only caused more pain. To me, that is an incredible moment in film. And it was worth making the whole film just for that, for people just to see that.
Yeah, and I think that maybe her reaction to that scene, if you take the scene as literally, her reaction to that might be a bit jarring. But yeah, as you say, when she kind of has to come to terms with that realization, acceptance that what she's done, it does kind of the performances in that scene as well, following the violence, is incredible. I think that was another one take afterwards in terms of the reaction of her. So yeah, that was a really, really powerful moment, as you say.
Yeah, I'm pretty pleased with that.
Yeah. Also, I mean, you mentioned just coming back to the technical aspects, you mentioned the lenses that you use, the vintage lenses. And, I think we've rambled on, talked extensively about the cinematography of the film. But in terms of the color grade and the edits, the post-production of the visuals, it felt really sort of raw and authentic. It didn't feel like you tampered with the visuals too much. I feel like in some of the moments, especially, it could have been quite easy to go in afterwards and put just a dark filter, like a dark wash over the visuals, to like heighten the mood, the darkness of the story. But even in the dark moments, it feels really raw and sort of gritty and authentic. I thought that really stood out as well, the visuals and the way it was graded.
Yeah, well, we had an exceptional artist doing the grading who has done some huge Hollywood films. So we were really lucky to get Billy to do it. And Kevin, the DOP, and I we're just in all the sessions together, and they'd gang up on me all the time, because directors always want to see everything. I want to see that look in their eyes, and they're like, no, you'll ruin the sort of contrast and the this and the that. And so I just deferred to the experts, and I picked my battles. Sometimes I was like, no, I absolutely insist that I need to see this part of it more. And so they acquiesce to that, because I would go with their recommendations 99% of the time. And of course, you know, deferring to the experts is always the best thing to do when you're making a film, I think.
Speaking of experts, we mentioned about your directing approach earlier and how it's kind of, you know, catered and tailored towards the actors themselves rather than kind of a blanket approach. In those one take sort of one-ers, you know, segments in the film, how did you approach those? They must be quite challenging to do, obviously. And you mentioned, you know, the majority of the film was done in, you know, just a handful of takes. There wasn't many, you know, retakes and retakes and retakes. How did you approach those specific one-shot segments in terms of direction? Because what we see in the final version of the film, those one-shot segments are some of the strongest performances, strongest moments of performance, which, you know, you think, you know, one side it could be easy because they were more immersed in the experience, but also it's, you know, probably a lot harder actually as an actor to, you know, be committed and in character and really give a strong performance in those long moments.
Yeah, they didn't seem to have any trouble. They just, you know, they did it. And I think that too was because we didn't mark the ground and say, you have to be here for this moment or that moment. We let them play it out and we worked around them. So right. They were, and it was obviously, it was choreographed because it is like a dance. The camera's working with their movements, but they were the ones who initiated where they were going to move and how it was going to be. Well, of course, we do things like, you know, we just need you to be angled a little bit more this way or that way at times. But because it was natural for their performance, I think that made it, you know, easier for them. And we did the hard yards of working around them rather than vice versa, which I think happens quite a bit.
Yeah. In terms of the score as well, like, how was that? Was the score produced in post, or was it produced alongside the film? Like, it really sort of complements some of those moments, especially the really sort of reflective and meditative moments of the film, and especially the spirit world. But there's some really sort of beautiful, like slow, reflective pieces. Were they sort of composed in, like, once the film was completed, or were they, you know, were you working with those in mind alongside the production?
Well, it's really interesting, actually, because Petra Saljo, who's the composer, she and I have been friends forever. And everything I've ever made or been involved with, you know, she's done the music for. So we have a very, very strong creative bond and relationship. And normally, Petra writes music off the script, and we would play that for actors or, you know, the crew even at times, or sometimes have it actually on set. But on this film, she didn't do that. And it's always just, again, an entirely naturally led process that we work to. So she did have to do like the right songs actually for being in the film, like the gang song, like Marjorie's song in the pub, which I love, talking about the no dogs, no blacks, like. And that's actually Petra, the composer, who plays Marjorie singing that song.
Okay.
And that's my dog Bob in her arms. So yes. So she had to write songs to actually be in the film. But for the first time ever, she actually didn't write music until we had started the editing process. And then we were able to sort of talk about it and build it. It was a different process for us in this film, but I just totally trust her, and I had no doubt at all that brilliance was going to come at the right moments, and it did. As far as I'm concerned, like, some of that music is just stunning, like that waterhole scene, which is also a little homage to Stanley Kubrick there with the Barry Lyndon candles.
Oh
That
yeah,
was like,
I see. Yeah.
Like they were real candles that God, the production design team were on canoes out there getting all those candles after lit. And so and I call it the love tree scene with Alexis or with Jarrah and Waru on the cliff top with the wind. Like when that music kicks in there, it's just it's her healing herself in that moment, and I just think it's so beautiful, And it's interesting, people always talk about the violence in the film, which really is not a great percentage of the film. It's a small percentage, but people don't talk so much about just these incredible spiritual and loving and poetic and lyrical moments that infuse so much of it. It's really interesting what people hone in on. I don't know why that is. Maybe because it is so raw and hard to watch, but maybe also it's hard for people to focus on love and healing equally. Maybe it's equally hard.
Yeah.
They're kind of the extreme.
Yeah. Well, I got two kind of points that are very different, so I'll kind of mention them both, and you can maybe pick up on whichever one you find to be more intriguing for you. So in terms of come back to the score just for a second. There's like a song that's used towards the end of the film. You mentioned that there's some songs specifically written for the film. There was a song used towards the end of the film where the riding. They're in the car, and there's also some horses riding alongside. It's sort of just before the final set piece. Was that song written for the film specifically?
Yes. When the door opens, like in the edit, when the door opens, I was bored by seeing how that is normally handled. I just didn't want to do what is normally expected by a door opening. And I also wanted to get into that heightened world of Gerald's mind, like his absolute just bullshit belief in himself and all his stuff and his fantasy, like this fantasy of who he is. And so it was his moment in the film to express and play with that. And I had a song in my mind that like a mainstream song that I wanted to use, but in the end I thought, why do I want to do that when I've got a composer who specializes in writing pop songs? And we sort of talked about what I was really wanting for that, and she came up with that song, and that's her singing the song too. So
yeah, it feels like a really, as I mentioned, there's a lot of juxtaposition in the film, whether it's the reality versus fantasy or the authenticity versus the kind of the bit more surreal moments in the film. And that was one of them that really struck me. I think I mentioned earlier, that door scene. It kind of cuts to this really sort of almost contemporary sounding, it's almost a bizarre song to use in that moment, but it works really well for his kind of strange worldview.
Yeah. And all the characters get their moment in this. The sort of supporting players, you know, they all get something that really informs them or speaks about them or where they're at. And yeah, that was Gerald's. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's even the tweeting birds from Snow White are also layered into the sound of that. So just to really enhance that sense of his fantasy world, you know.
I didn't even notice that. I'll have to listen back to it and try and pick those out.
Yeah. The other bit of sound design that I really love is when he is sort of like in that devilish mode and he's breathing and he's just ramping up, and there's that layers of sound coming in over the top of each other. I actually said to the sound designer, I want it to be like a Mad Max car, you know, something like really grunty, like from the original Mad Max. And she said, oh, yeah, I worked on that. I think I've got those tapes still from the original V8s. And she pulled out the original Mad Max V8s tapes and she created that soundscape from those tapes. So there you go. I've never told anyone that.
That is impressive. I like that. That's an exclusive then.
Yeah. And honestly, when you're in the cinema and that comes on and you're just in that full surround sound, it just hits you in the guts and just rises up through your body. And it's just like, oh, you just want to scream. So, yeah. I'm so sad it's just not getting to be in cinemas.
Yeah. I've been to a few. Recently I was at a short film festival, and there's a lot of people there who's either their first shorts or their first festivals, and having even just short films being aired in the cinema, it's just a completely different experience. And obviously we've had a year and a year and a half with no cinemas. I'm not sure. I know Australia was in lockdown for quite significantly longer than the UK was, so it must be quite a shame actually for the cinema experience, really not having the opportunity to to have that cinema experience.
Yeah, well, we managed a short cinema run, which was something, just sort of like wedged into a little window between lockdowns. But yeah, I wish that you guys could experience it in the cinema. It's really worth doing. I'm happy to get our distributors to supply DCP if anybody wants to run it.
Okay, so just I know it's late and I've had you for long enough now. But just to wrap up, really, there's a couple of moments in the film which I've been like looking at like reviews and such online, just to get a general sort of consensus of where everyone else is at with the film and how it's been received. There's a couple of moments in the film which have really stuck with people and really resonated and been really striking. And then there's a couple of moments in the film which maybe a bit more challenging to not accept, but challenging to sort of come to terms with, or challenging to what's the word? Yeah, just kind of seeing on screen. There's a couple of moments in the film. I think one of the main potential like criticisms of the film, I guess you could say, is this kind of redemptive arc for one of the attackers that's shown on the screen. And you mentioned earlier in the interview that you wanted to show, not just the bad, but the good, the potential for violence and harm, but also this potential for healing, growth, and redemption. So was that something that anyone ever maybe challenged you on, or ever spoke to you about in the writing process, or in production, or was that something that everyone was really on board with in the production?
Yeah, everyone was on board with that, particularly. So in the process of writing it, I worked with Gunter Wang, which is a female elders artisan collective. And it's maybe 10, 15 female elders from all different nations. And so we went and just did a lot of script work, like just going through it, reading it, just getting where they're at with it. And it's really important to them to promote the healing aspects of not only the film, but our nation. And we're not going to do that without forgiveness and compassion and understanding and having the vision of people being able to change and grow. And I mean, I don't know what's more important to that for the health and well-being of our planet and people than finding that way to understand and heal and move through those spaces with each other. So yeah, look, it's a very divisive film. Some people absolutely hate it, and some people absolutely love it. There isn't a lot of, meh. It's, it produces strong reactions, and it's not a normal film. It doesn't follow, oh, this is a classic 3-act structure and it's a hero's journey following one hero from beginning to end. And it's not that. It's messy. It's life. It's like it really is.
Yeah.
So I can understand people who like things to be the way that they're used to or the way they think they should be, that I can understand them not liking it. And I'm okay with that, because I think it's how it wants to be and how it is, and I love it. So I'm just really happy.
Yeah. I just had a little brainwave actually when you were talking about it there. It kind of reminds me, I'm not sure if you've seen the film The Burial of Kojo.
No, I haven't seen
Okay, so I'm having a mind blank actually here. I've forgotten the name of the director, but it's an African story about it's a kind of a story about stories, and it's kind of presented as this unfolding. It's a woman telling her childhood recollections of her parents telling her stories, and it has similar. Now I've thought about it, it kind of has similar, very loose narrative or very divided narratives. It has these kind of surreal moments of there's this like bird-like creature that is kind of haunting this child, and these dream-like qualities that are kind of present in your film. So I was just wondering if you'd seen that film, because it kind of, when you were talking about that film, that kind of made me think of that film a little bit actually.
Yeah, well, I'd like to see that film.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's a Netflix original, but I believe it's on Netflix in most countries. I'm gonna have to.
The Burial of Kojo.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to double check this now, because it's gonna really. Okay, so the director is called Blitz Bazawuli, and he was one of the co-directors of Black is King, which was the Beyonce film, if you've heard of that. He was one of the co-directors of that. I believe it's on Netflix. Yeah, it's on Netflix in Australia.
Fantastic. Yes,
And it's only an 80-minute film. So it's very divisive. Some people absolutely love it, and think it's, amazing. And some people, I guess it's more a kind of perspective of their view rather than the film itself, in terms of whether they're more willing to accept those more surreal and more fantastical elements that are kind of born out, even though it's a very authentic and sort of character-driven story. But yeah, I just had a connection. Just made the connection there. So
yeah, I'm gonna. Yeah, well, people, I think one of the professors of film studies here who wrote a small piece on the film, I think she sort of talked about it being like a fever dream as well.
Yeah, I used that term to refer to a film recently as well, which was kind of, again, very surreal and hypnotic and almost like a hallucinogenic dream.
Yeah.
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 There's been a lot of those
Yeah.
films
Well,
recently,
look,
actually.
I just think, yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe it's because, like myself, love it or hate it or however you feel about it, it's not boring. And I'm pretty tired of just knowing what's going to happen in a film from the first couple of scenes, to be able to know blah, 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 and that's how it's going to end. You know, I don't want to make films like that. I want to make films that are unexpected and surprising and challenging and rich and bold.
Yeah, you balanced the action and the drama really well in this film. You're never bored. And even thinking of now how you'd categorize it, you know, it's got drama and action, but it's also got horror and fantasy, and it's almost like a really hybrid of different genres. But at the same time, it feels, I don't know, familiar, but also different at the same time.
Yeah, it's a nightmare for the distributors. You know, to be able to categorize something to sell it.
Yeah.
And this is really hard to categorize.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll let you go. Was one final question before I do. I think in one interview, I'm not sure if you've mentioned this elsewhere, but I was reading one interview that you'd already done, where you mentioned that this could, you know, you wanted to make this film because you felt like it could potentially be your one and only feature. If I'm not mistaken, that's something you said in an interview.
Well, I think I probably said it may be the only chance I ever get to make a feature.
Yeah.
You know, you just never know. So I just wanted to absolutely go for it.
Yeah.
And make the film I wanted to make. And
And
at
you did.
least I can,
Yeah.
and I did. And even if I never get to make another film again, I'm just so thrilled to have made this one.
Yeah. And so have you got any projects in the works in terms of writing or directing, or have you got any plans or projects in the go, or?
I do, but it has been a very difficult time for independent filmmakers to get their projects up. That's but we're sort of pushing ahead. I've got a couple. I'm not sure which one will be the first one that ends up falling over. It's like into being made, but I'm done with the really brutal, hard stuff for the time being. I feel like I've said all I need to say with this film. The next one is the one I really want to make next. I can't even tell you the name because it's a bit of a title like Snakes on a Plane, you know, the moment you say it, like there's the film, you know exactly, or you've got a picture of what, and I'm not willing to blow that out at this stage, but it's big and bold and super fun and really subversive and action, lots of heart, love story, but not a traditional love story in any sense of the word. And it's about multi-generational female relationships, but in a kick-ass action, fun context.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I always like my action to have meaning.
Yeah.
Even if it's fun, you know, fun action can still have meaning.
For sure, yeah. Okay. Actually, I did just think of one question because I asked this to everyone at the Short Film Festival. I asked this to everyone at the Short Film Festival, and I actually got some interesting responses. So, obviously, we just come out of, you know, well, we're still in the pandemic, but we're, you know, slowly, at least in the UK, moving out of lockdowns and stuff like that, and getting back to some kind of normality. And obviously, it's had a big impact on the filmmaking industry. What advice would you give to up and coming independent filmmakers like yourself who want to get involved in film, especially at this stage at the moment? What advice would you give to them?
It's a hard one. I was talking to a finance guy the other day, and he said to me, he thought I was thinking too small about the next film, because I was talking not about the film I was just telling you about, but I was talking about a smaller film that felt like it was doable in this sort of like COVID-y times. It's a small cast, limited location, really handleable. And he said, businesses are going gangbusters through COVID. He said, I've had the best 2 years of business that I've ever had. And he said, you've got to liberate yourself from this mindset that, it's hard or it's tough. And he said, go for your big vision. You need to go for the big vision. Don't sell yourself short just because of what's happening. And he really did give me a bit of a kick up the behind. And I just thought, yeah, I have been buying into my fears and limitations and it's going to be so hard, or it's just impossible. And that mindset is not how you get a film made. You have to believe and go for it and go big and go hard. And that's what we did to make The Flood and everything that we've ever made, really. So I guess I will pass that kick up the behind forward from him to just go, don't go low, go high, and really push it and go for it, because that's what people are attracted to. Big vision.
Yeah, well, that's a great piece of advice. Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. That's actually quite an interesting piece of advice. But that's one thing I've not actually heard anyone say to that question. So that's actually quite a unique and interesting perspective. So that's really a really great answer. So thank you for your time. I know I've taken up almost in total more than an hour now. So yeah.
Oh well, there you go. See how much filmmakers love talking about their films. So
I can forward to talk to you about
and it's always a great pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, John. I've really appreciated your interest and your questions. It's been a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you. And yeah, go watch The Flood.
Yeah, and let me know what you think.
Thanks for watching, Super Friends. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to hit the subscribe button just down below and hit the bell so that you can get notified whenever we release brand new videos. In fact, there's 2 more waiting for you to watch right here below. So what are you waiting for? Why not click play?